Welcome. Each month I put together a quick summary of the status of solar cycle 25, comparing it to the equivalent time during solar cycle 24 to get some idea of how big this cycle is going to be and how much it may affect us. So this is my report for March of 2023. These are some of the main points we're going to cover, but I should point out that I do a lot of this analysis myself. So we're going to see things here that are not available on other solar sites around on YouTube. For example, solar cycle 25 is tied for the 15th largest solar cycle on record. This means that solar cycle 25 is an average cycle to slightly below average cycle, and the average size of a cycle is a sunspot number of nearly 180. It is certainly outperforming solar cycle 24 so far, and also the NOAA and NASA models that were predicted 3 or 4 years ago. There is no signs as yet of solar cycle 25 leveling off and reaching maximum, although we're beginning to get into the window where maximum is possible. And it looks as though that solar cycle 25 is an average length cycle, and I'll explain why I think that in the coming slides. If you're familiar with my presentations, you'll have seen this plot before. This is a rendering of the sunspot number for the last 13 years in various formats. The yellow lines here are the daily sunspot numbers, and you can see they oscillate wildly from day to day. The blue is the monthly average sunspot number. There's quite a bit of noise on that, but at least gives you some better idea of the trend. And the red curve is what's called the smooth sunspot number. Solar minimum between solar cycle 24 and solar cycle 25 was in January of 2020, shown here with the blue line. We are now 39 months into that cycle. So how does this compare with the equivalent period from solar cycle 24? Solar cycle 24 minimum was in January of 2009, and so that would put it in April of 2012. And you can see the general sunspot number is lower, but not a great deal. There was a very large peak at the beginning of 2012, which some people thought was actually maximum, but it turned out not to be. The peak in 2014 proved to be larger. Have we had our first peak yet in solar cycle 25? Possibly. And will there be others? Quite probably. We have to wait and see for those. Well, how is solar cycle 25 doing? Here are the plots of the smooth sunspot number for the previous 24 cycles shown in black, and solar cycle 25 shown in red. At the moment it's tied for the 15th largest sunspot cycle, and looks as though it may well overtake at least one more before all is said and done. So this puts it to be a slightly below average or average sunspot cycle. About 3 years ago, NASA and NOAA came up with a prediction for solar cycle 25. It's shown here in red, with the gray area being the uncertainty on that prediction. So far, the actual data shown here with black diamonds is well ahead of that prediction, and it's outperforming that, and consequently also outperforming solar cycle 24, which had a very similar profile to the NASA NOAA prediction. So this looks as though this is going to be a larger cycle than solar cycle 24, and much larger than the prediction from solar cycle 25. However, it depends on how long this rise of this cycle carries on. If it carries on into the middle of 2025, certainly it will be much larger. However, it could bottom out and stay flat for a couple of years, like solar cycle 24 did, and you can see that on the left. We could take a look at smooth sunspot number, comparing it between solar cycle 24, here shown in blue, and solar cycle 25 here shown in orange. And you can see it does not make a great deal of difference between the two of them. Solar cycle 25 is outperforming solar cycle 24, but only by a little bit. However, solar cycle 24 looks as though at this stage it started to flatten out, which in fact it did. We don't know that solar cycle 25 is not going to continue on up and increase the differential between the two cycles. This is a new piece of analysis that I've just completed by comparing the sunspot areas between the two cycles. Again, orange is solar cycle 25, blue is solar cycle 24. And what I've done here is I've added up the daily area of the sunspots measured in millionths of the area of the sun, and sum that over a full rotation of the sun, i.e. 28 days. And you can see overall, solar cycle 25 is outperforming solar cycle 24 by about 30%. NOAA numbers the major sunspot regions that come onto the sun and get a number of parameters associated with them. Just counting the number of NOAA regions since solar minimum for solar cycle 25 and comparing it with solar cycle 24, we find that solar cycle 25 is outperforming solar cycle 24 by about 17%. Are flares an indicator of how the solar cycle is going? Well, if that's the case, solar cycle 25 is going to well outpace solar cycle 24 by nearly a margin of 2 to 1 if you just count C flares. Now, C flares are useful from the point of view that there's a large number of them, so the statistics on them are very good. Now, M flares, which are 10 times larger than C flares, are less common, but even though there are fewer of them, they still seem to be outpacing solar cycle 24 by about 2 to 1. So that's somewhat reassuring. Now, everybody loves X flares because they're the largest type of flare. There's 10 times larger than M flares. And solar cycle 25 is outpacing solar cycle 24 by about 30%. However, there are very, very few of them. We've only had 16 X flares so far in solar cycle 25. So the uncertainty on these numbers is very large. So this should be taken with a grain of salt. Perhaps we should rely on coronal mass ejections. Here we have fairly large statistics. We've had over 3,000 of them so far in solar cycle 25, and that's outpacing solar cycle 24 by about 30%. I've summarized the results of those comparisons that we just went through. Now, I'm not going to read each one of them. I'll remind you that 3 years ago I made a prediction that this cycle would be about 165 plus or minus 30, and that was based on regression to the mean and the shape of solar cycle 24. All the others come out to numbers anything from about 130 all the way up to 250. On average, all of these different indicators indicate a cycle of about 170 with a standard deviation of about 40 on that number. So anywhere between 130 and 210 seems to be the likely range. So quite an active cycle, and certainly a lot larger than solar cycle 24. Another interesting analysis that you won't see elsewhere is the drift rate of the sunspots towards the equator. At the beginning of a solar cycle, sunspots appear at high latitudes, and they slowly drift towards the equator. When they reach the equator, that's about the end of the solar cycle, and the new cycle starts up at higher latitudes again. I've plotted here in orange the northern hemisphere and in blue the southern hemisphere, and you can see they're both tripping towards the solar equator at about the same rate, and that gives them the same prediction for when solar minimum would be, which is June of 2030 or April of 2030. So if you assume that that's the length of the solar cycle, then we can do a quick calculation of what the peak of the cycle is going to be. So let's do that. As I say, in the northern hemisphere we're predicting a minimum at June 2030 and a southern hemisphere April of 2030, remarkably consistent with one another. The average rise time to maximum in most cycles is about 40%. So the maximum date forecast from this would be January of 2020 plus 50 months, which is March of 2024. So we've got about a year till solar maximum according to this particular calculation. Now the sun has a habit of fooling these sorts of things, so let's not put too much money on that particular bet, but nonetheless it's an interesting indicator. What conclusions can we draw from all of this? Solar cycle 25 will very probably exceed solar cycle 24. Solar cycle 25 has already exceeded the highest estimates for those predicting a grand solar minimum. So we are pretty much putting grand solar minimum to bed now for at least another decade, hopefully much longer. With the guesstimate we have so far for the peak of solar cycle 25 will be in early 2024 with a peak of about 170 units, which is just below an average cycle. So all we do have to do now is wait and see what happens. This is going to be a fun time to be observing the sun with the solar cycle increasing and activity increasing. So thank you for watching. So until next time, stay safe and goodbye.